I always.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to From Pages to Platforms. I am Elizabeth Arnold, head of growth here at ViralMoment, and I am just beyond excited to bring together these amazing women working in not only social intelligence and understanding culture, but also in books and publishing. And it's kind of amazing, right? Like the way that the world has shifted because of social media, because of TikTok. It's shocking that everybody used to think publishing was a slower industry and was going to kind of like lag behind, and they are not allowed to do that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that's crazy. So I'm really, really excited today to bring you together to chat all things books. And I'm going to make the intro a little bit shorter because we have some amazing data that we want to make sure that we're surfacing for everybody. So if you are here, if you're watching right now, drop in the comments, what are some of your favorite books that have come out that you've read recently? Let us know where you're coming in from. We'd love to chat in the comments as well. Drop your questions there throughout the whole webinar as well. We will answer those on the go. We'll also set aside time at the end to make sure that we're covering those questions. Everybody that's attending the event today, you'll end up getting the amazing report provided by Kim Townend that we'll go through as well. So you'll get to keep these stats. You'll get to bring those home and just kind of keep flipping through it and see how that's relatable to yourselves, your businesses, your industry, things like that. So with no further ado, I am really excited to introduce you to Lindsay Reeder from HarperCollins Publishing. Lindsay, say hi. Give them a quick intro.
I'm so excited to be here and talk with Kim and Elizabeth and all things book talk today. It's going to be awesome.
Yay. And I'm really excited to bring together Kim Townend. She has an amazing agency that does a bunch of social listening practices for brands and businesses across the space. Kim, tell us a little about yourself.
So for those of you that don't know me, I have been working in social since the very dawn of social. Almost 20 years at this stage, and I've been using various forms of social data and social intelligence to help craft my strategies for like the last 10, 15 years. I think I've been using social listening. And over the last few years, I've moved really specifically just into the social listening space. And my speciality, if you can call it that, is I am super interested in how we can use social data, social listening specifically, to understand like the broader cultural shifts that are happening. Obviously, micro trends, very exciting, great for creating content, but I'm really interested in the bigger picture, like how we can use social data to understand how the world is changing, and in many cases try and get ahead of that. So yeah, that's one of the things that we are going to be discussing today. I'm super excited to be here as well because I basically just get to nerd out with other people, other women about books for 45 minutes, which is my dream webinar.
Awesome. Should we pull up all the work that you've done and start diving through?
Sounds good.
All right.
Cool. So the whole point of this webinar is we're going to be discussing BookTok specifically, but how it's actually functioning as a culture driver, and how it's much bigger than I think people realize. The kind of impact that it's having on a huge scale. We're going to start with some BookTok stats because I love a stat. And then do the social listening bits up front. So you've got a bunch of interesting data points that you can take away and put in ducks. And then we're going to talk in the second half about the broader cultural shifts that are happening. So as Elizabeth said, if you have any questions or comments, do drop them in as we go and we'll do our best to answer. So the first thing to mention is that BookTok is so big. I'm not sure people realize the actual size of it. I was quite surprised when I averaged out the BookTok views on a monthly basis over the last 3 months and realized it was basically 9 billion views a month the hashtag was getting at the moment, which is an insane number. Like television would never come close to anything like this. So although people think of it as it being a thing that girls on the internet do and potentially not that important, it's actually this massive cultural juggernaut. And there are, I think there's 310 billion views accounted to BookTok as we speak, which is a lot.
That's a lot
Let
of
me do that.
views. You were like you said it. You really can't get that with, putting an ad on TV. Or maybe you can. I've never done that. However, this is a lot of views for probably very, very little money. That's wild.
It's very difficult for my brain to even process what that number of things would even be.
No, it's funny because I think when people are when you think about 9 billion people, if I watch TV on cable, old school, when it comes to the commercials and all the ads, that's when I go to TikTok and play on my phone to entertain me while I wait those 2 minutes until I come back to the television show. So it's indicative, that number is outstanding.
Yeah.
Cool. So I wanted to look at some of the key themes that were surfaced in my BookTok search. Obviously, BookTok, as we've just discussed, is absolutely massive. So there's 1 million things that we could talk about. So I've had to be really, really mercenary in the things that I'm actually picking out to discuss. But some of the interesting things are 31% of the posts that I analysed used the term bookish alongside BookTok. And I thought it was really interesting that bookish has now become a kind of a self-descriptor for people within the community. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the deck. Recommendations accounted for 25% of all posts, which is a really large amount. When it comes to social share of voice, 25% is unheard of. But people also consider themselves BookTokers. There's a real community feel to this. People calling themselves BookTokers and bookish. TBR, everyone knows what TBR is, right? I assume, because you're at a BookTok webinar.
Read.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Okay, cool. Make sure I'm on top.
So TBR is an ever-present threat. It currently accounts for 7% of the overall conversation, and that is quite evenly split between physical TBRs and then Kindle TBRs, and the terrible combination of two. So you've got two ever-looming piles of books that you have not got to. And then the other thing that I thought was really interesting was I looked specifically for mentions of not just trope, but also some of the main BookTok tropes, including enemies to lovers, all of the big guys. And that actually only accounted for under 2% of the overall conversation. So although people think that BookTok is very heavily trope driven, we're not actually seeing that much of it with the BookTok hashtag. It may be different on individual book tags, but BookTok itself, slightly less trope driven than originally imagined.
Interesting.
Cool. So I also wanted to look at what the top genres are in BookTok, and this will come as no surprise to anybody at all. But whenever I talk about BookTok and I talk about how big romance is and how big fantasy is, and I included romantasy in both of those categories because there's no way to split it out. Yeah. But yeah, when you put those two together, that accounts for over 60% of all genre conversation on BookTok, which is quite a large number when we consider the amount of videos and views that are coming off that. Horror is also experiencing quite a renaissance at the moment, and this isn't just because it's coming up to Halloween, because this data runs from I think the beginning of June. So we're actually seeing sort of alongside this slightly nicer face smut element of BookTok, we're seeing horror start to make a resurgence, and that kind of gothic element come back into play. Horror and spicy currently have the same amount of tags. Spicy is now a genre in itself. It's not just spicy romance anymore. There's spicy everything. As I think I saw spicy hockey romance as a tag the other day. So we've really got into that. But one of the more interesting things is that thrillers are getting virtually no mentions. Classics, no one's really talking about anymore. And then I don't even think crime made it onto this list because it was under 1%. So that the true crime era is well and truly done when it comes to books. We have moved into romantasy, fantasy, and an edge of horror.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think what's a big genre for us in publishing was always historical fiction too, and it's indicative of like just where we're seeing things from a retail standpoint and so on and so forth. So noting that that's not even showing up, but was such a huge genre even a year or two ago, really interesting. And in many ways, you could combine romance and spicy in its own world, and that's 55%. And if you add the data together, it's wild, and it's makes for some very interesting conversations at work. I'll tell you that.
Kim, Meredith is asking if you did you disambiguate horror from dark romance when you did this chart and looked at genres?
Yes, romance, like dark romance, came into romance as a genre, and horror was specific to horror and horror talk and various keywords around that. Yeah, dark romance was not covered off in horror because I just feel like that is not a vibe.
There's another question that came in from Laura too, and she's saying, when you were doing some of your research, I'm sure that you saw like a handful of titles that popped up across the space too. Laura's wondering if A Court of Thorn and Roses was driving ACOTAR, as all of us know it. Do you think that was actually driving the significant portion of that romance conversation, or was it kind of spread out?
I've got the data on this, not in this report, but I looked at the amount of mentions of ACOTAR just in the last 4 months, and I think it was clocking in at something like 8% of the overall conversation still in 2024. So yes, it will be driving a percentage of it. It's probably driving more romantasy than straight romance. But although that obviously, although Sarah started it all, I feel like it is grown so exponentially since then that it's almost irrelevant because it's like where you start, and there's almost a kind of a feeling of like it's a little bit basic because there's so many millions of books now and everyone's read that. It's a bit like, when people say I really like TV and then they tell you like The Wire is the greatest TV show ever made, and you're like, have you watched other TV shows? I feel like with romance and romantasy, ACOTAR is like The Wire of romantasy.
Yeah, it's like the foundational start to what happened.
Agreed. 100% agree.
Yes. And one other thing while we're still on this too is you mentioned that horror was coming back in in the summer. And we actually just had a webinar with Sherry Khan, who runs like the Jason whole community and like all the scary stuff. And she had told us that there's actually a resurgence of Halloween and kind of fearful stuff in the summer. So I wonder if it's kind of coinciding with everything that they're doing in media as well.
Well, it does play into Summerween, but Summerween, and I could talk about this for hours. No one will be interested in this. But Summerween is like a very different vibe than the horror vibes, because Summerween is definitely got like more of the spoopy vibe than the spooky vibe, because it's Gravity Falls based and is like kind of goth light as opposed to like hardcore, whereas the horror community slightly different. But the horror community do start gearing up for Halloween like on like August, because people are like, August, that's AU, that's autumn, that's Halloween. So yes, but maybe not Summerween, I would say.
Summerween.
Love that term. Never heard it. Love it.
Lindsay and I are going to use this now.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. What else are we looking at?
So the next thing to note was that, and I'm just trying to make everybody understand how important BookTok is in terms of being basically the world's largest recommendation engine for books at the moment. We know that it's getting 9 billion views a month. 12% of the posts tagged BookTok were also tagged book recommendation, and that's just the ones people actually tagged book recommendation. That's not just like anything where people are recommending a book. BookTok is basically the place that people go to find out what they should be reading now. We've seen like, sadly, a lot of kind of the book blogs and the older people, like places you'd go to find out what was happening, like die a death and be replaced with BookTok, because there's just nothing that can compete with it. And book recommendations across all genres are happening on BookTok as well. And this is also kind of the big differentiator between the other two massive book communities, Bookstagram and BookTube, is BookTok really functions as a recommendation engine, whereas the other two are more focused around like community aspects. And then the other thing that I wanted to discuss quickly, I talked about this a little on one of the earlier slides, is that we've seen such a big resurgence in people considering themselves bookish. And when I was chatting with Lindsay last week, we were talking about how it was only like a few years ago that bookish was still considered like quite a derogatory term, and it wasn't something that people would label themselves particularly. But the same way that we've seen across like a lot of TikTok, the way that girls have reclaimed what were traditionally like slightly derogatory ways to address them, we're seeing that with bookish. So the way we're seeing like marketing girlies and corporate girlies be used as a hashtag that's kind of more about empowerment and owning who they are, bookish has gone the same way. So we've got this entire generation of women who are really proud to be readers and of what they're reading. There's no shame in it anymore. Those days of like women reading Twilight like with a different book cover on the tube, or or being embarrassed about reading 50 Shades of Grey because of the content, those are over, and it's very much a like, I'm here, I'm bookish, I'm reading what I want, I don't care what you think vibe.
Yeah, and I think that this blends really nicely with the format of books overall. So obviously there's print, there's digital, so ebooks and audio. And I think everybody reads across the gamut. Like everybody reads a little bit of everything. But what I find interesting about BookTok in general, and this term bookish, and people they want to be seen with a physical book. People like the idea of having a book in the background, holding a book, and even just getting on the subway in the morning. You'd be surprised how many more people are holding books. It's a real thing, and it's really lovely to see the reclaiming of this. And it's nerdy is cool, and people like it, and it's been really lovely to see across the industry overall. So especially with like print in particular.
Yeah.
I love that. And I love that just for like society as a whole. I think there's the whole women empowerment movement, right? We had the Brat Summer, we had, Kamala running, and women empowerment, feminism's here. Like we're really starting to embrace ourselves. And I think bookish is kind of leading into that. And honestly, like I wish that I had grown up, I grew up in the 90s where girls had to not be nerdy, like in the social era. And so bringing that out in women and girls and surfacing that it's good to be nerdy, it's good to read whatever you want to read. Who cares what other people think about it? So this term makes me really happy. Just like as a female, raising a female child, it just brings me joy.
Cool. Another thing that everyone should know about BookTok is that it doesn't really exist. It's hundreds of thousands of tiny micro book communities with like one big hashtag at the top that helps people find their recommendations a bit easier. If you look at this slide, I've pulled out some grabs from ViralMoment around cosplay BookTok communities and then romantasy BookTok communities. And you can see that there's all of these tiny little TikTok communities that are formed around these micro niches. And that's how BookTok functions, not as like a top-down recommendation, but as all of these tiny communities with like one big hashtag to help you as you begin your journey.
Communities are some of my favorite spaces that ViralMoment can bubble up for us. It's so interesting because it leads you just from like, okay, the hashtag book and bookish and BookTok are great and they exist and that's where we're searching, but like what's underneath the hood, like fantasy BookTok and spicy BookTok, and I mean there's so many interesting things that end up showing up as you start to uncover and go deeper. And It's a
And
great
each of these hubs actually feel like community in their own way, and it feels less alone. Like if you go into any of these brackets or any of these conversations, there's a community there baked into it. So it can be the weirdest and best cool thing, and there's somebody talking about it. It's really, really special that way too.
Yes, a great way to surface your books in the right area as well.
Exactly.
You know, when you're working on marketing or when you're trying to push a new author or a new book, you just go into that space, find the right creator to maybe talk about it for you. Absolutely.
And then a thing that I'm sure everybody in this webinar knows, but BookTokers are actually older than you think. This data, take with a tiny pinch of salt because it's social listening data around audience demographics. And as we know, the API limitations around everything make this difficult for us to uncover. But from the data we are able to find from various listening tools and follower accounts, most BookTokers are actually firmly in the younger millennial category and not in the Gen Z category. There are Gen Z BookTokers, but there are way fewer of them than there are the younger millennials who are really driving a lot of BookTok. It's not as Gen Z as you think.
As an elder millennial, this makes me feel a lot better. I'm right on the cusp. And so even the what is it, 35 to 44, I think that number is going to look different in 6 months. I think it's having a resurgence. Everybody's talking about it. People like to be part of a bandwagon. I think we're going to see that number go up and up and up. And when I look at these numbers, what's really interesting from a, income kind of standpoint is you would think like an 18 to 24-year-old, they don't have a lot of disposable income to go be buying books, right? A millennial is in a bit of a different stage of life. So when we see sales and when we see things like that, that really correlates with what we're seeing on BookTok, again, against all the communities and the conversation. So it's really interesting in terms of the sales data that we're seeing that lines up with this particular graph in particular. Like it's interesting.
Yeah, I think also you basically stopped going out by this age, haven't you?
Yes.
You're just
and what's
staying
not
home
in
and
here
reading.
is right. And then if you 60 is like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine. But then like my mom is on Facebook, like recommending books to all her friends. So we're not talking Facebook today. And I get that.
Yeah.
I think that like that's a whole different group and that's a whole different type of book. Right. So thinking about consumers differently in these brackets is really important. But we'll keep it to BookTok today. It's just interesting that like different groups and age demographics go to different platforms overall.
Ooh, absolutely.
We would be remiss if we didn't mention that there are some problems with BookTok. Although it's brilliant and it's got a lot more people reading and there's a lot of great qualities to it, some of the things that people have issues with BookTok are as follows. I'm sure Lindsay will be able to speak to this a lot more, but basically the whole way we defined books up until 3 years ago was with a genre tag, and then the way you decided whether you wanted to read a book was the paragraph on the back, the book blurb that explained to you what happened in the book and gave you a general vibe. That is out the window now, and I'm sure loads of the people that are actually using the BookTok tags have no idea that it's all just from Archive of Our Own and fanfic. But we've now seen AO3 tags basically replace book blurbs. People use tropes in place of paragraphs. So there's an element of BookTok having slightly dumbed down what some people may have considered a sacred thing. And along those same lines, BookTok has obviously massively elevated self-publishing, and self-published authors are now able, particularly on their first book, to sometimes make a lot of money and get a genuine amount of fame off the back of just one published novel. That's brilliant. Also, sometimes it does show that there may not have been a copy editor involved. So there is some chat again among the slightly older community about like the quality sometimes of not just the self-published books, but also the books that are being published by publishing houses. And again, following on for that, like slightly dumbed down vibe. We've also seen, and this is happening across basically all fandoms these days, but BookTok can be pretty toxic and start to making demands of authors if they're not happy with the way that the characters are being treated, or they don't like the ending. People are concerned that BookTok is making publishing a fast fashion style industry where it's all about like overconsumption, and that TBR and book hauls are also playing into that idea of overconsumption. And it's not reading as a special thing that should be savored, and instead it's really about like churning through books. And these are some of the complaints that people currently have around BookTok. Lindsay, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I feel like I could comment on each of these buckets that you've talked about, because I do think like the fast, or what we sometimes call it, rapid publishing, it is here, and I think it's indicative of what the community and what the consumers are telling us, right? Like, gone are the days where we can say in 9 months this book is coming out and get excited, but that is how our industry was built. So right now I'm working on books that are coming out in November of next year, and I'm creating marketing plans for them with my team. But I think it's a challenge because things are dropping in really quickly and changing. But I would say that, so you can look at it with that negative lens, 100%. And it's changed for many people in this building that I'm in. But I also think it's an opportunity for a new way of doing publishing. And frankly, I think it's here, and we have to be adaptable and change really quickly. And I think that's indicative of like the things that are ending up in books, and equality, and all these different things from a diversity and inclusion standpoint that need to be included on books and within books now. And I think we are there, and frankly, I think publishing is having a harder time catching up to what's happening. And I think that I'm really grateful that I work within a company that is open to the change, is asking a lot of questions, but we're also listening and using tools like ViralMoment to go in and understand what the community wants, as opposed to saying like, well, no, this is the box that you all have to get onto, because I think that's kind of how it's been in the past. So each of these are things that we've talked about at Nesium, but I also think that there's opportunity within each of them as a publishing company to expand and think beyond. And yeah, I think rapid publishing it's a thing, and maybe from a copy edit standpoint, that's sure, people have opinions, but there's like been other books out there that like are classics that we're all like, oh, what a snore. So I think that there's like, at the end of the day, if you're walking into a bookstore and purchasing a book, who cares? Like, it's important that you're buying books and you're excited about art, and all books are art, in my opinion. So I for me, that's like meh. Like, there's always going to be a bit of snobbery when it comes to book people. Period.
As with like,
to begin with, they're booksellers and not. I always found that funny when I worked in a bookshop. It's like, oh no, we don't work in retail. We're booksellers.
Yes. And I think that's just part of it, because we all like to be known as bookish, whatever that means for people across the board. I think it's just changing in a younger demographic, which will then change how publishing is done in 5 years. So here we are.
Yeah, it's amazing. I have so many comments on these, but I want to keep with time and like kind of flip a little bit forward too. So, Kim, let's go beyond BookTok.
Okay. So I'm just going to talk very quickly about how BookTok is sitting alongside search. I always like to use search data with my social data to understand if the trends are relevant and if they have left the platform that they're on, and what is happening around those.
Oh, that's me. You want me to change the slide? Here we go.
There we go.
Sorry. So I'm just so excited to tune into this. Okay.
So looking at BookTok specifically, and this is people searching for BookTok on Google as opposed to people searching for BookTok on TikTok. The thing that I thought was really interesting, because it runs contrary to everything we've seen on TikTok and then everything that I talked to Lindsay about, is that September and October are the least searched months when it comes to BookTok, and we're seeing like a massive peak of interest around summer vacations and Christmas vacations, which is the opposite of TikTok And everything I know about books, traditionally October is when it all kicks off and everyone wants to grab their blankets and start reading again. But when people are searching for BookTok, they're searching primarily in summer and at Christmas. Reading the next one. And then just to point out the reason that we haven't really talked much about Bookstagram and BookTube is that this graph shows 5 years of Google search data. And you'll see that somewhere around 2021, BookTok overtakes the much more established BookTube and Bookstagram. And then by January the 1st, 2022, there's no coming back from BookTok. It has just begun its upward trajectory that continues as we speak. So although the other two platforms still exist and people are using them, like I myself use Bookstagram more than BookTok because I am old and I do not want recommendations from people who have not read as many books as me. But BookTok has eaten the rest of its competition, and that's why that's going to be our focus.
I think the seasonality is really interesting, especially the difference between TikTok and Google searches. And I wonder if it has to play with like maybe parents searching for summer reading for their kids that shows up, like if that plays a part in that. But it's fascinating to see that's like two very different conversations happening on different platforms.
Yeah, I think it's probably the people who aren't on BookTok who have heard about BookTok that are searching for BookTok trends. So they're not actually BookTokers themselves, otherwise they wouldn't be Googling it. So I think that's where we're seeing it. People who are maybe like lighter readers, but who want to understand what BookTok recommendations are, but who also don't use BookTok themselves. I think that's probably the explanation.
Yeah, and from a seasonality standpoint, just a fun fact, not necessarily within this data, but just Mother's Day is the biggest book buying holiday across the board. So we see a huge and it's really interesting because you would think, people would start thinking about it in May or in April before Mother's Day, but it's really like the 2 weeks before Mother's Day when people are like, I got to get something from mom, and so we see a huge opportunity within that. So, but that's separate of this, but I just think from a seasonality standpoint, like, yes, the holidays are huge, but nothing like Mother's Day.
Is there just like kind of going down this rabbit hole, and we'll go back to this community thing, but is there a specific genre that tends to show up a little bit more during Mother's Day that children lean into to give their parents?
Yeah, so I would say it would be general fiction, romance, and then thriller. Those would be the top. And then with Father's Day, it becomes very status quo, nonfic, the end. And that's like there's never crime, there's never fiction, there's never thriller. It's always nonfiction.
Sports biographies only.
Exactly. But it's a really low sales numbers. It's just interesting overall.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I think that 100% plays into what people are searching across Google during these times
exactly.
as well. As both of those holidays show up. It's fascinating.
And the final thing before we talk a bit more about publishing was, so I used Glimpse to understand what the upward trending topics in their books and reading category were. And I thought it was very interesting that at least 4 of the biggest upward trends and the most stable upward trends, you can't really see it on this screen, but you'll be able to like zoom a little more when you get the deck yourself. But basically a stable trend is one that is not doing spikes, that is doing like an upward trajectory on not too steep a slope. That most of the most stable trends are BookTok trends themselves. So we're seeing BookTok there, but we're also seeing dark romance, hockey romance, the genre that will not die, and then spicy books, which is quite a non-specific trend. But yeah, it's just testament to the fact that people are potentially hearing about these things that are trending on BookTok without being BookTok users themselves, and then going away and Googling what on earth that could mean. And so the spread of BookTok is actually much bigger than just the views that we're seeing on BookTok. It's people hearing about it on TV shows and from their friends in offices, and then they're going away and Googling it.
That's crazy. I do love that, like, hockey romance is just a thing. It's like so specific. It's not sports romance. It's hockey romance. It's like this niche sport, and like it just makes me happy. I think that's hilarious.
And we're seeing an upsurge in football romance because of Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce, which blends into probably some of what Kim will talk in a couple future slides. But I think that like that specific relationship is like having a surge on that type of fiction that we're thinking about in the future. So.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And Chelsea just made a comment about this too in the chat. Is just, it's really cool to see how like TikTok trends trickle their way into the real world, or the real world, to your point, trickles its way into trends.
Exactly.
It's fascinating.
This is me, huh?
It's you.
Yeah, dive into like your world, Lindsay. Fill us in.
Yeah, so I've been with HarperCollins for 5 years, but I've worked in book publishing for 17 years, which I won't do the math for all of you, but it's been a while. And that means that I've been around from bloggers to YouTubers to then to Instagram and now to TikTok. So, and with all of that, I've always worn a digital strategy hat. So I'm a marketing director, but I've touched those different buckets as they've grown. And in my 17 years, I've never seen anything like BookTok happen, and the impact of what happens on your phone come into our business like it has. It's been one of the most fascinating and interesting things. And I certainly think that when the pandemic happened, anybody in books will tell you that we did not have the impact of other retail businesses that were suffering. We surged. We were having a great couple of years because everyone was stuck in their home and reading, and that was obviously awful for some reasons, but great for the business.
Oh no, did we lose her?
I think we may have lost her.
Goodness. Okay, well, we'll give her a minute to see if she can reconnect here. But I mean, to what she was talking about is fascinating. Like,
it's like kind of excitement around it. There we go. You can hear me, see me?
Yes. Sorry, you cut out like right after you were talking about just how publishing worked in
no worries, in the pandemic and all of that. Sorry, I could see it spinning. Yeah, so essentially we were very fearful, like puzzle companies and like all those other things, where it was like, is this still going to have a moment post-pandemic? And luckily there was a post-pandemic, we came out the other side, but I think BookTok has carried that momentum in a really positive way for publishing overall. And it's bled into 3 different buckets, which is social listening and using tools like ViralMoment to really understand what people are excited about on the platforms, what people are talking about, which is really great. Then you go more into the bucket of influencers as a whole. I think influencers, they get a weird rep, and I get that. But I also think that somebody with 1,000 followers can hold up a book and have much more impact than somebody with 300,000 followers nowadays. And I think that's incredibly exciting. And that's due to the AI and the algorithm within TikTok, and also because of the book. And it has such an impact. So it's hard to strike gold. But we had a book called Before the Coffee Gets Cold on our list. And there was a young woman, she was in her bedroom, and she had mascara running down her face. And that video alone has kept that book going for years now, since the pandemic, for 4 years. It's been incredible to watch. So that's been really exciting. And then moving more into publishing acquisitions coming out of this. We're listening, we're watching, and we're learning. So in the last 2 years, much of the conversations I'm having internally here in HarperCollins are related to what does the community want and what are they talking about? So we just acquired an amazing book called Blood of Hercules by Jasmine Moz, which comes out in November, which was a self-published book and now has been bought by a big publisher. And we've put some spins on it. We've added some foil to the cover, and that's all great. But this came out of BookTok, and I think that's indicative of what's starting to happen and will continue to happen. We are still obviously bringing in tons of different books that aren't necessarily BookTok books, and they're different books that work still within the genre and without the 18 to 35-year-old range. But I think it's been the most interesting part of the conversation of really understanding what people are saying about it. And I often use a lot of tools to kind of better understand, is this just like a few people talking about this book, or is the internet talking about this book? So it's changed and it's taken on many different forms. And we have an influencer database now that we can go to and say, hey, do you want to like talk about this book? And while we can't always, necessarily like be like, okay, it's going to strike gold and they're going to make this video and we're going to sell tons and tons of copies. Again, just creating conversation within this community is important. And so I think it's just changed how we've thought about it all across the board in every facet of our business. It's been one of the most rewarding and exciting parts of the conversation. But it was just, I remember during the pandemic, just TikTok coming and be like, what is this? Do we have to do this now? And I will tell you that no one internally knows how to make a good TikTok, but we know how to watch TikToks. And so as Kim said, like the second I show up in a TikTok, it goes those views. But if I put somebody that's on my team who's 25 years old on there and I say, go to town, make a bunch of videos about this book, you have no rules, do your thing, add whatever audio, those things can have real impact. So it's been really interesting and it's reshaping how we have to think about marketing as a whole, but it's been really fun. So that's my kind of 2-minute spiel on BookTok and publishing, but it's changed the game. It will continue to change the game. And again, I think even 6 months to a year from now, it's going to look really different and much more evolved.
It's fascinating. I also love how you're, you're empowering like the younger generation to lean into like what they do well. And that's in book publishing, which is great. You see even elsewhere, there was the whole trend a couple months ago. I don't know why it's escaping me, but the car dealership and the intern, and the day that all of the data went down, they made an Office episode and they were like, we're just going to do this for fun. And it went viral. And I'm sure, I have no idea on the stats of this, but I'm sure it increased their sales and their share of voice, all that stuff. But empowering, the generation that's actually on TikTok to talk for you and not giving these rigid, I work in marketing and these rigid rules that you kind of learned in college have all gone out the window now.
Right. And as I in different phases of my career, as you go, I don't want to say up the chain, but as you do, your opinion has to get more weighted in the conversation. But I'm learning that it's incredibly subjective. And the second we start to put layers or rules against TikTok in general is the second it gets muddied and not work. So I think the new rule is step away, trust your staff, understand that they spend multiple hours a day on this platform and they understand what's going on, and let them have full reign. And I think that's been working for us from where I'm sitting anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen it working with your team too. And even just what you're doing across TikTok and TikTok Shop, it's impressive how you've let your team run the conversation effectively and well. And you do a great job of surfacing the right data to authenticate, who you're talking to and make it worth it.
Exactly. Thanks, Elizabeth. That's very nice.
It's evolved. Cool. Let's chat about some of the crazy things happening from media to publishing to media.
Cool. So if we can just skip to the next slide, we're going to talk a lot about how romance is currently in the process of being legitimized. As something that was primarily thought of as a woman genre and not for high art and not really legitimate. We're now seeing romance everywhere and it's getting critical acclaim. I'm sure you're all aware of the A24 movie coming out in a month. A24 have done a romance, guys. That's big news. And then the success of Nobody Wants This, which obviously everyone has gone wild for, and got renewed immediately for a second season, where we saw the Greek mythology Jeff Goldblum show get cancelled almost immediately after the first season. So it's weird to see that kind of shift between the sort of more traditional masculine superhero stuff, which is dying. See the Joker sequel, and then kind of the rise of we're seeing romance sort of rise up to take its place. And I should put in Hitman in here as well, because obviously a bit of a dark romance, but definitely still a rom-com. I didn't put The Fall Guy in, but we've seen that happen as well. And then Daisy Jones and the Six, obviously direct from BookTok. moving into, so we're seeing it both in terms of adaptations, specific adaptations, and then we're also seeing it like on a broader scale, in that people are recognizing that romance is a thing that women are interested in, that the stakes have changed. When I was chatting to Lindsay last week, we were talking about how many times we'd seen the Adam Brody meme from Nobody Wants This about the like "you're not too much for me" bit, and how every woman in the world had like lost their minds over like a healthy romance being depicted on a show. And I think it's just that kind of stuff that's really indicative, because that type of romance started being talked about in YA like 10, 15 years ago. That was where we saw the foundations within, well, not BookTok at that stage, but definitely like bits of Bookstagram and BookTube, those foundations being laid about like what women could expect from situations which were very different to the previous definitions. And we've seen that grow, and those readers grow up, and now we've got it influencing like much wider culture. I don't know if Lindsay had anything else to add to this.
No, not really. I think you touched on all of it, but I do think that this is like the romance and the tropes and the healthy relationships, especially LGBTQ plus, is really blending into conversations, into books. I think it's where we want to be. And I do think it's interesting that you mentioned YA, because that was 10, 15 years ago. The data is showing that they're now 10, 15 years older. And again, so they're aging into this. And so we have to continue to evolve. And I think that's happening within, movies as well, which is really, really healthy and lovely to see.
Oh,
I've always loved the evolution of books to movies, and I think the movie industry is kind of getting some of the hints, probably from some of the comments and things that are surfacing on TikTok, is like, let's stick with the story. Like, we're big bookish fans here, and like we like the book the way the book is, and I think that's actually starting to show up in quite a few of these, which is nice. It's like they're finally merging beautifully.
Yes, exactly.
cool. And then the slightly less likely bedfellow of BookTok, which is fashion. If we run through to the next slide. So it's really easy to see how BookTok is going to influence movies and TV. It always has. We've always seen adaptations. But looking at the BookTok to fashion route is slightly more complex, in that there's one extra step. There are basically 3 steps: starting niche, going to mainstream, that BookTok to fashion follows along. So the first one, if we can go to the next slide, is community. And when we see things happen organically in the community around fashion, when it comes to BookTok, it's very much cosplay based. And it kind of runs the gamut from hardcore cosplay people through the whole way to people who are just like, I dressed a bit like my favorite character today, like regular clothes, but still outfit inspo. So we see the most of the hardcore cosplay in romantasy and historical fiction, obviously. And a few of these that we've pulled out here are ACOTAR, Bridgerton. Let's never forget Bridgerton was a book before it was a Netflix show. And then I've just added one up in the top, because I'm not sure if everyone's aware this is happening, but Narnia Talk is a thing. It's a thing now. Prince Caspian is back. Everyone's very excited. I'm definitely here for Narnia Talk. But that's our first step in the BookTok to fashion journey, is we start with community and cosplay. And then we go to the next stage, which is, if enough people are interested in the first stage and we start seeing enough views on videos, we're typically beginning to see indie brands who usually are a bit better at understanding their audiences and have the capacity to be much quicker off the mark when it comes to things, because they don't have all those layers of bureaucracy involved. This is where we start to see people do targeted collaborations or create official merch. So I've pulled out a couple of things here. Snag Tights are in the UK. They're like an inclusive tights manufacturer, but they understand their audience very well, and their audience are massive romantasy nerds. So they were one of the first brands to do an official ACOTAR collection, which I think they made a couple of years ago and have continued making ever since because it's a really good seller for them. And then a slightly less small brand, but still an indie brand, still female owned, Olive and June, have gone the other end of BookTok and did a collab where they combined forces between BookTok and Nail Talk. What a combo! To do a Colleen Hoover collab as well. So this is typically the second stage along in the BookTok to mainstream fashion and cosmetics journey, is going to be indie brands doing the targeted collabs. And if these go well and people start talking about them, then we move on to the final stage, which is where things become a lot less targeted and much more vague. So instead of it being like a specific outfit, it's more of a general aesthetic vibe. And one of the ways that we've seen this really manifest this summer was the rise of the milkmaid dress, which tapped into like a bazillion different TikTok trends. But really, when we look back to the origins of it, it's from cottagecore and it's from historic fiction. And it's those two communities that both were wearing these outfits in slightly different ways, but the same outfit, and how they've grown and grown over time. And then we've seen the milkmaid dress completely overrun mainstream fashion, but with no mention of where these actually came from. It's just like, it's appeared. Fashion had an idea. And I just think it's fascinating that we can look back to like tiny micro trends that start. I mean, when cottagecore was 2017 on Tumblr, and then like watch it grow and evolve into things and cross over into so many other trends, and then ultimately get picked up and commodified by a big fashion brand. But those are the kind of long journeys that we're watching happening from micro trends to like macro movements.
Yeah, and this is, this goes back to quite a few slides ago when we were talking about communities and understanding who's talking about your stuff. So if you understand as your brand, who is my market and what do they like? So for the nail example you just had for the indie brand, that's great. Like they know that their market is women and maybe bookish women. And so they're leaning into that. And they're like, we have the same market, let's collab. And I think that's great. And the milkmaid dress is hilarious. And I think it's just great how it came about. But Bridgerton core is huge. It's emerging. And Bridgerton's gone from the book to like the very, very well-known series now into literally fashion statements, which is, I mean, quite the gamut for a book to take. Like as an author, I'm sure like you would never imagine that would happen. Or as a publisher, either you're like, wow, like that's a crazy evolvement. But we're seeing people even link it to other more like macro trends like coquette. And so like the coquette trend has really leaned into BookTok and Bridgerton. And it's just kind of like it all emerges and evolves at some point in time. And this is like a great way to see that evolution over time of how a book can actually take over culture in different areas. And if you know your market, if you know who you want to go after, who is your audience in marketing, even though it's changed, Lindsay, we know this, you still have to know who you're talking to. And as long as you know that, you'll be able to like tap into the parts of the internet and the social media that's important to you and to your customers to make it relatable.
To know who you're talking to and to know what they're talking about. I think that's the other piece of it, of really understanding what they're into and then shaping what we're helping build and bring into the ecosphere of all of it. I think it's a two-way street from where I'm sitting anyway.
Absolutely. And collabs are everywhere. Like Kim, you just pointed out, I mean, not even across BookTok as well, but there's the Reese's collab. There's Michael, Sarah, and Sarah V,
Yeah.
So
like they're just amazing collabs, right? And it's coming through elsewhere. And I think it's great.
Yeah. And I think people are actually really open to it as long as it feels authentic. The thing on TikTok, but that is different than other social platforms, is I think people aren't as anti-brand on TikTok. They're quite happy as long as it feels authentic and right, which is obviously, very different than say Reddit. But it's all about understanding your audience and being able to create content that like works, that doesn't feel gross. Basically, don't be gross. Brands, don't be gross.
Exactly.
It's so hard as a brand to be like, I'm B2C, I promise I'm cool.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Give it to your Gen Z peeps, and like they'll do it for you.
They'll
right?
know what to do.
Cool. And then there's just a couple more things. So we've also seen BookTok begin to influence the way that we are living in our homes. There's a few data points in here. The first one is that home library is currently on the up and is predicted to continue to grow over the next year. I don't know how much of this is based on the fact that people aren't having children anymore, so they're just turning that room into a home library. But home library is definitely a thing people are interested in now. Also, book nooks are so big. I didn't realize that other people cared about book nooks. I remember back in the day when I'd watched like YouTube tutorials for book nooks, and they have grown to such a massive. I think now that like on TikTok they've currently got 995 million views, which is again quite a lot for like a tiny crafting project. And you can buy them in the real world. You don't have to craft them yourself. Everyone knows what a book nook is, right?
Yes. Oh.
Okay, cool.
I'm like, yes, of course they do. Yeah.
How could you not?
And then the final trend, which is like such a bugbear of mine, because at the beginning of the year everyone started writing about bookshelf wealth. And I saw it reported as a trend on at least 5 to 6 major publications, and I've been tracking the data since it began, and it still hasn't taken off at all. It's got like some views on it, but primarily because a few big publishers wrote about it, and it is basically using bookshelves to as an aesthetic thing as opposed to a place to home your books. It's very much taps into the kind of bookshelves and reading as aspirational and positioning yourself as like a reader or someone with books. You know, the kind of Kendall Jenner is reading female lit like stuff. It's very much that vibe, maybe slightly less genuine than some of the other content we've examined throughout the course of this. So yeah, we're seeing books begin to impact the way that we live and the rooms that we're putting in our houses and what we want people to think of us.
And Meredith made a point early on as well in the comments here, and she said, like, do you think that interior design and home renovation space intersect where people show off their library builds, even if they aren't book talkers? And I think there's like two places here. Like, yes, it falls into this like bookshelf wealth area, and then interior design. Also, they know their market, and if their market is women who like to read, let's lean into that. Let's give them, you know, the space to be creative with showing off their books and how to show them off.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see home library alongside that, because it feels like they're two like polar opposites. Like home library is like, I take reading very seriously. I have a room for my books. Whereas the bookshelf wealth is like, behold my books, you know?
Yeah. We're all just wanting to be Belle with that like ladder. That's like what a book nerd wants.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that's so romantic about having a library in your home, even if it's the bookshelf wealth or if it's like a whole room. I think that also probably stems from some of those romantic-y conversations. Is like in all of those worlds, they live in like these homes that have a library. Like they're like, oh, I was sitting in the study in the library surrounded by these beautiful books that were so old, or these tomes, or whatever it is that they're calling them. But there's a romantic feeling to.
And any like TV show or movie or anything that you're watching right now, they have some kind of bookshelf vibe within the home itself. You'll notice it now that I've said it, but like there's always a nook of some sort. They never read within the actual movie or the show, but there's always a book nook of some sort.
It's just like implied that they're readers. They're bookish.
They just want you to know that they're evolved.
We were also seeing an uptick in America, at least, with Gen Z signing up for libraries and starting to go to libraries more, which is credited with to BookTok as well. So IRL data, it's going across the board.
So just great conversation, but how can we move forward from this?
Cool. So there's like just a few points here. If we can skip to the next slide. So one of the biggest issues with BookTok, and if we're honest, most of TikTok, is a lot of bigger brands do not seem to get it. I think that there's still kind of a weird thing where like the over 30s are a little bit scared of like TikTok itself. Everyone has an account, no one posts. They just lurk all day long. And I think that this is kind of a proliferation of that, with a lot of the people working in marketing roles in bigger brands being slightly older and not really understanding like what to do with TikTok or BookTok. And obviously, as we talked throughout this deck, we've seen it massively disrupt both the fashion and cosmetic industries, and then do the same with publishing. And what is really interesting is that we're seeing smaller, like indie brands and then tiny creators like jump into the place of where brands could be doing like bigger collaborations if they understood their audiences slightly better. So if you do a search of BookTok, not even a specific book, just BookTok in general on Etsy, you'll see like thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of merch come up that move at the speed of culture and are not like taking 6 months to come out. So how can you avoid being one of the bigger brands that doesn't get BookTok? If we can skip to the next slide. There's basically like 5 quick tips. And the first one is get a social listening tool, guys. Do not rely on what you're seeing on your For You page. Your For You page is specific to you. You and your friends will think it is a massive trend. It will have 15 videos in it. Do not rely on your For You page. Check it out on a social listening tool. Social listening tools are brilliant for a variety of reasons, but just always think about bookshelf wealth when you need to get someone to sign off paying for a social listening tool. The second thing to do is hire a consultant. There are so many of us these days. And having someone who understands the community that you're trying to tap into and who can understand who the right influencers are, who the right creators are, the right style, like what the key trends for you are, how you should position things. Quite an easy way for you to like tap into the right community in a non-gross way. The third thing, follow the people in your community and take your cues from them. Please don't listen to other brands. Very few brands are actually doing a brilliant job on social media, despite the fact it's been 20 years. All brands are obsessed with looking at what their competitors are doing and then benchmarking against their competitors. And that creates this sort of weird false economy where everyone's going, we're doing brilliantly, but like we're all benchmarking against other people who may not be doing that brilliantly. So follow the people that are actually in your community, follow the creators, understand what they're doing, use that as your benchmark for how you should be behaving, what people expect, like what the vibes are. The fourth thing, and I talk about this all the time, please check with search data. Social media is brilliant. I love social media. I love social listening. Look at the search data alongside that to see how it's working outside of the tiny bubble that we're looking at in social media. Use Google search data, use TikTok search data, whichever is the most relevant to your audience, but do check it with search data to understand if it's trending up, if it's trending down, if you've missed the peak, if it's actually not as big as you think it is. And then the final recommendation from me would be just try and work with the smallest, most agile team you can. Less red tape, more room for creative flex. Learn fast, fail fast. If you want to test it out by putting it on stories first, do that. That's my 5 things.
I feel like truer words have never been spoken. These are really good tips.
These are great. And I think, this goes just beyond BookTok. This goes to every other brand that's out there as well. Using social listening tools, you get rid of that algorithm fog. Grab someone like Kim, plug her in and be like, hey, who is my community? Who is the market I need to go after? What is it that they're talking about? And how can I be authentic? And then follow those people in your community. There's a really good example of this from the ice cream industry. And the name of the brand's escaping me, which is kind of driving me a bit crazy right now. But they're an ice cream brand, right? And they were like trying to get on shelves. They were having a really hard time gaining this traction. They're like, actually, our ice cream is marketed towards people in the fitness space. We are the ice cream and the treat that you have because of all of these different things that they have in their ice cream that makes you better after fitness. And so they changed their branding to look more like a power bar in the ice cream section. They ended up like marketing just to fitness people, and they ended up becoming like the #1 fastest selling ice cream in the market. Like in just a short span of months. It's kind of a wild story. If I can surface it again, I'll post it back on my LinkedIn. But it's fascinating, like leaning into your market. Don't look at what your competitors are doing, to Kim's point, and do what's authentic to your community you're trying to get in touch with. And then
I thought that was really brilliant advice, Kim, because I smirked and I like even scoffed a little, because I think you're so right. I do think we all look at one another and say, okay, well, that's success. But I do think going beyond that is like the thing everyone needs to be thinking about doing, myself included.
Yeah.
No judgment. I know
No,
what this lifestyle is like. I've worked
good.
in it too. It's just, yeah.
It's like
there's
real
there's great creators out there.
Yeah, agreed.
This has been an amazing conversation and chat. For everybody that stayed on a little bit longer than the 45-minute mark, sorry, not sorry. We love talking about books, but I appreciate you chiming in, asking your questions. If you have more questions for us, you can find us on LinkedIn. You can send me an email, elizabeth@viralmoment.com. I will forward it over to Lindsay and Kim if you can't seem to figure out how to get in touch with them. But just so you know, if you want to get in front of more of your audience, and you work in a brand, or you need to have a social listening person on your side to work with you, reach out to Kim. She's brilliant. She does some amazing work using tools like ViralMoment, other resources that she has as well, to ensure that you can actually connect with your consumers, move beyond just the trending topics, and actually like be a part of like the cultural shifts that are happening. On the other side, Lindsay is doing this amazing job of leading HarperCollins to become cutting edge. HarperCollins, like we said at the very beginning, publishing industry is like generally culturally known as like a slow moving industry, but like with this and everything else that's happening with social media, they can't be anymore. And so using tools like ViralMoment helps them to stay ahead of the times, target their consumers better, know exactly what these bookish people want to read, and go after the right authors to write those books, publish the right things, and get ahead of them. So if you want to get in touch with Lindsay, chat about HarperCollins, how they're leading the charge for bringing publishing into basically this new era of social media and technology, chat with her. She's super awesome to chat with, as you can tell from here. She's one of my favorites. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. You have a great rest of your week. It is Wednesday, so 2 more days and it's off to the weekend. So thank you all. We'll chat soon.
So much fun, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Bye.
Thanks, Kim.